Bam.
This is Rich Ledet, and you are watching and listening to the Break It Down show.
I told you to say handsome Rich today.
I know, but I can't do that.
Take that microphone of yours and tilt it a little bit away from your mouth. It's a little bit too hot. Too
How's
hot.
that? Is that
That's
better?
fine. Yeah, that's a little better. Hey, man, you and I, let's do a little bit of bona fides because folks don't know, and folks who don't know. And we got to give them an idea. We're going to talk about the state. We're going to talk about corruption and shadow governments. And we're going to apply some of what we did in Afghanistan to what is probably coming down the pipe in Ukraine. And I'm going to say this part initially up front. Ukraine is not Iraq. It's not Afghanistan. It's not the middle of somewhere Africa. However, we are the same tool. We're the same bludgeon. We're the same toolkit. So let's talk a little bit about why you and I specifically have authority to talk about corruption and reconstruction and all these different tools in the American toolbox.
You want me to go first? The audience
Yeah,
knows you more than me.
yeah.
So I'm not a Ukraine expert, nor am I an expert on the post-Soviet life, life in the post-Soviet states. But I do understand, not just from an academic perspective, but also practically speaking, I do understand and know what you mean when you say we are the same tool, because the same United States government that sent you and I to war zones to do work will be and is actively engaged in supporting the Ukrainian people right now, militarily. And once this stuff clears out and hopefully the violence ceases soon, we're going to be involved in reconstruction in some way, shape, or form. And I don't think our government's just going to be doing government work. I know our country's probably waiting for things to be a bit calmer so we can help promote business and the business environment and get that off the ground, particularly energy and agricultural production is what Ukraine, well, the rest of the world wants things to be calm so they can engage in economic activity uh, with Ukrainian businesses, the government, and the people, the civil society, right? Um, so I mentioned that I had an academic understanding of some of this stuff. I'm trained as an American comparativist by trade, but I've written, in addition to writing, three peer-reviewed papers, two of which you helped out with, and a book chapter. Your names are on there too. I've have two peer-reviewed publications specifically on corruption, political corruption. But I looked at the United States, and I treated the states as units of analysis. So that's a bit of what I know. And if anyone in the audience wants to reach out, if you can't, if you can go on Google Scholar and find out who I am and see everything I've published. But if you'd like some direct links to article because of a paywall or something, just send me an email. Let me know. So I've got academic experience on the subject, but I've also got some practical knowledge, particularly working with you in Afghanistan, in addition to being an ex-infantry soldier myself. So I've got some familiarity with the DoD and working in a bureaucratic capacity for the United States government. That was long-winded, but did I get
Mm,
to the point?
that's all right. I'm going to show you an image because one of the things, look, when you've done this work as long as I have, and then I bring someone like you who's got the academic experience, there's tells. And these are things where as soon as I hear someone with American talk about things, I'm like, oh, there's a problem, right? And so I'm just going to show you an image because these images are often tells. And there was a thing in the Baghdad province out in the country, that's the farmlands. And you hear and see these things and you go, oh, there's a problem, right? So I'm going to put this image on the screen. And Rich, you're instantly going to see the problem. Here we go. Okay, so there's a thing called the Green Medine, and the key word here is co-op. All right, so we're going to have a co-op out in the farmlands of the Baghdad province. Ready? Here's the image, everybody. Bam. So anytime you see the white arm. It's embracing the brown man or the brown hand, right? And then you see greenhouses, tractors, seedlings, and all of these things to work to help the Iraqi farmer. Rich,
Well, yeah, I'm just wondering if the Iraqi farmer needed help in the first place.
what?
My first
Of
is
course, he's it was stupid. Yeah,
what my first reaction. Um, but at least he tried to get his shirt to kind of, the maybe match the Iraqi farmer's hat. Like it's like this similar pattern. I'm colorblind, so I see a similar pattern though. So
yeah,
he's trying with the plaid, I guess, farmer plaid. Uh,
yeah. It was like a plaid and a houndstooth check. You're right. There's a
mhm,
crazy pattern thing.
mhm.
But yeah, so you have this co-op idea, right? We're always trying to create these things, these ideas, these concepts that I always say this briefs well, right? Why don't we help the Iraqis be more efficient farmers? Why don't we help the Afghans grow grapes better? Why don't we help the Ukrainians have modern farming techniques? But we go out there, and I swear to God, if you type in any kind of AI chat thing and you say, "What is the green medine?" you will see a positive art. When anybody do this, go to your standard AI thing and type in, "What is the green medine?" And I'll type this in here so you guys can. I'll do this test yourself. What is the green medine? And when you type this into your search, you'll get a positive result. The green medine does not exist. It didn't exist when it was there, right? So what? And I'm going to just give you this anecdote, and then I'm going to shut up and let Rich do his work. So here's what would happen: the State Department would say, "Hey, Canadian Iraqi guy who wears a snazzy suit, shiny, speaks English. We're going to come out. And you're going to show us the green medine and its great work it's doing." And so he would bring in the pretty girls from Iraq, the city girls. They would put on their beautiful hijabs, and they would put out this fantastic spread, and they would talk about all the great things that the farmers were doing with the co-op. I worked in this area, and you know what I would do? I would go to the Green Medine before the meeting when there'd be nobody there. I would talk to the farmers in the fields before this meeting, and then we'd have the meeting, and I'd eat the delicious chicken and all the chuba and all the things that were there, and I would listen to the bullshit show. And then you know what I would do after that meeting, Rich? I'd go back out and I would repeat the process, and I would say before, during, after. Here's what happened, and there was no co-oping of anything. It was all briefable as working. And it became the darling of the State Department for the
Yeah.
reason. Look at what we're doing, right? And it was all bullshit. I have a picture of me on one of my old phones where I'm holding as many stacks of hundreds as I can put in my big hands. And that wasn't all the money we were going to hand over that day.
Mhm.
And so that is corruption. It's lies to ourselves. None of it ever worked. But if you look at the historic record, if you go ask that chat AI bot what the green medine is, it is alive, it is sustainable, and it was never, ever, ever there. Never.
Yeah, wasn't it supposed to be, and this is Wikipedia, wasn't it supposed to be a not-for-profit agricultural cooperative?
Yeah.
Yeah. So what were the stacks of hundreds for? 'Cause I
Now
mean that
click on any of the reference links. They're all
yeah.
dead.
Oh no, I see somebody a book written about it. We Meant Well: How I Helped Lose the Battle for Iraqi Hearts and Minds by former PRT team leader Peter Van Buren.
Peter Van
Heard,
Buren's a buddy of mine.
heard
Yeah.
that guy. Heard that guy before.
Yeah. He's
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, this is again another example of it briefs well. And the people you and I always reference the spaceship. The spaceship's up there. I mean, here in academic world, I call it theory land. There's philosophy, there's the way the world should be, and then the way the world is.
Mm.
Um, and even going back to Afghanistan, one of the reasons why I think you and I worked well together is because we're interested in that gap between theory and practice, between the spaceship and what's happening, boots on the ground, essentially. And that phrase "boots on the ground," I think we've got that in two peer-reviewed papers in the title, because it means something, right? What do you see? What is the empirical reality that you see? And I mean, thinking about the United States trying to, I'm gonna use my air quote, improve agricultural production, that to me is laughable. and its face value. I mean, even before deploying to Afghanistan, because people have been farming in this part of the world long before we ever invented tractors, long before we ever invented modern fertilizers, long before modern day economic systems were even developed. So, if we're trying to, I'm inclined to say, if we're trying to improve anything, we're trying to improve it for our benefit. That's what I'm going to look at first. And maybe we want to increase the yield of a crop so the farmers there can sell more of the crop and make more money. But even the idea of making more money doesn't always translate well. And some in particular, I mean, I didn't deploy to Iraq, but I could say, at least in the Afghan case, a lot of farmers I talked to didn't they wanted to feed themselves and their family, and provide for their people, their extended family and people in their village. The idea of making money, wasn't really, yeah, everybody likes money, but that's not their primary concern. So even introducing some of our market values into their market systems, I would say is in itself a form of corruption, because we're corrupting a system, you
Yeah.
know.
One of the conversations I had before you had got to our part of Afghanistan was with a major from the army, and he was part of the ag team. And I'm pretty rough on these ag teams, but I
Yeah,
promise these
for
guys
good
can take
reason.
it.
For good
They
reason.
can take it. And they wanted to, and I don't want to get too lost on the ag side of things,
Mhm,
but we are illustrating this gap that you're talking about between theory land, the spaceship,
mhm.
the policy land, the State Department, and then the ground, right? And this guy was talking about pomegranates and all of these things, agricultural farms, female farmings, these all of these tools to help these farmers. And I said, what's the market chain? Like how have these farmers in this valley performed? Can you describe it? And he's like, no. And then my obvious response and question is why are you fucking with it? If you don't, and I literally said that, like, why are you fucking with it? Like, if you don't know what the market chain is, who's buying these pomegranates? Like, what person is actually going to pay money and put this pomegranate into their mouth? Is that person in India? Are they in Pakistan? Are they in, say, Seattle?
Mhm.
If you don't know, and this is where this whole phrase come from, like, you cannot presume to improve the condition of something that you refuse to understand the condition of, right? And this is all goes to corruption. And
Yeah.
yes, we're talking about little micro slivers of it, but if you cannot stop that bleeding of corruption into your system, everybody understands that any help that you give is theirs for the taking, and they
Mhm.
should do whatever they want with it because no one cares about them, and so they should just take whatever's available and use it however they want because we have completely corrupted the system. I'm shutting up and let the PhD
Yeah.
talk.
Well, I don't want to veer. I mean, a couple things came to mind as you were saying that. And I mean, one thing was, of course, the collection centers that you and I have spent a lot of time looking at, sitting under for shade, waiting for a ride. Collection centers in Afghanistan, a nice tin concrete and tin metal shack that were supposed to, all the Afghan farmers are going to have this central location where they bring their crops to, so that the vendors can come and view the crops and decide what they want to purchase.
Yeah.
And that was, again, like, just not understanding the system to begin with, because in the place where you and I work together, that's just not how agriculture had ever been done. In addition to the fact that we're asking farmers to put their produce under a hot metal, in a hot metal structure, for one thing. Um, that totally, I would go back to, say, corrupted the system, because that's not how agricultural
Mm,
production moved from the farmer to the vendor. The vendor wanted to see the plot of land where the produce was grown,
yeah.
and that was also part of relationships between the buyers and the sellers. I mean, not the individual person going to buy a pomegranate, but the big business coming in saying, we've got a relationship with you going back generations. I've seen these pomegranates trees since they were seedlings, and I want to buy this plot, this whole row of trees. We had very little understanding of that. If we did understand it, we certainly didn't implement that into our operations. you know so having boots on the ground to make that observation about how the economic system, how the market works in the first place is valuable, but you also have to get that knowledge to the top, and it's got to be received though at the top. But and by the top I mean the spaceship we're talking about. Um, because in policy world there's often a tendency to overlook this kind of on the ground knowledge, and we see it in many of our different development efforts that we engaged in Iraq and Afghanistan, and we will probably make some of the same mistakes in Ukraine once the conflict kind of diminishes to the point where we can operate a bit more safely. We're going to make some of the same mistakes because we're going to lose track of that local knowledge. We're going to lose track of what actually, and I'll use the word culture, what kind of culture has developed around whatever this thing is that we're working on. So and the other thing I was thinking about, again, I don't want to get too far off base here, was I'm constantly brought back to thinking about, you and I wrote a paper with my life partner Sharon. We wrote that paper on female engagement teams, and when you were just talking about how we just fundamentally didn't understand that thing that we were trying to change, we had really surface level knowledge. By we, I mean the Department of Defense, and to a great extent the Department of State. We only had surface level knowledge of the lives of women in Afghanistan. Now that surface level knowledge told us enough that women are worse than second class citizens in society. Taliban treats them harshly. And if you're paying attention to Afghanistan today, it's only I would argue that it's gotten worse since we left than it was before we've gotten in there. And in particular, because our information is much more limited now than when it was before, right? But people at the State Department, people at the Department of Defense, the policymaking level, that spaceship, they didn't have the boots on the ground knowledge. And again, if they had it, they overlooked it, they avoided it, and they didn't implement it. Because, you know, there have been authors that have engaged in ethnography in that part of the world and have taught us a lot about what it means to be a woman in a Muslim culture, specifically in Afghan culture, amongst Pashtun people. There's not a lot of it, but it's there and it's recognizable. But I think what happens is, you know, the people at the top, the policymakers, and that whole policymaking process is often prone to overlooking things. And I'm not saying it's always malicious, but sometimes it is. Ignorance itself is not bad, but once you know
Mm.
something and then you choose to remain ignorant about, for example, what's really going on in that village cluster with the women in that compound, not accepting that reality and not implementing it into your planning procedures, that in itself I think is a form of corruption. Because
Yeah.
it's a form, it's dishonest, it's unethical. A willful ignorance and remaining ignorant, I think, I will go so far as to say that that is an ethical challenge in itself. you know but in this case, it's not necessarily being done for personal gain, which is what the more traditional definitions of corruption tend to involve. It's using your office or your position of power for private gain. What we're doing, and specifically, I mean, going back to the female engagement issue. Yeah, we have this noble pursuit. We're going to make the lives of women better and more comfortable. We're going to empower women, but we fundamentally don't understand, or don't acknowledge that we understand, really what it means culturally to be a woman. You know,
Yeah.
in Afghanistan, and I know you've seen some of this in Iraq as well. And again, I don't want to stay too much
Yeah.
on the
Well,
female
let
issue.
me grab us and pull us back towards the root, because we've established this ground reality that we struggle to communicate vertically
Mhm.
well, and when the feedback loop is negative, it's if it even gets to the top where it might be fixed, it's usually rejected, that reality. So we know that there's a problem there, and that corrupts information and the ideas coming down. It's like, wait, hold on a second. What do you mean co-ops don't work?
Mhm.
And so that corrupts internally the ability to, and maybe I'm using corruption in the wrong way, but that does, it influences the ability of the machine, the policy machine, to choose wisely, right? Because
Yeah,
it's incorruptible. And
yeah.
so it will not change.
Well, I don't
So
think
there,
using that
yeah,
word the wrong way though, and that
yeah,
was kind of my point with kind of hammering on the female engagement team and the collection centers was because corruption, you have to define. Yeah, I'm a political scientist, and you cannot sit in my classroom and hand in a paper without defining your terms. Like, what do
yeah,
you mean? And corruption is one of those terms that, in my discipline, it's not difficult to define, but to have an acceptable definition that's
yeah.
going to be acceptable across, the range of scholars. So we have to be very specific. In my research papers, I had to, this is my definition of corruption because I have to define it before I can
Mm,
go observe it. So that's why I make a distinction between, you can corrupt a process, right?
right.
So it's really getting to the point that this term that we're talking about, right? It's you have to define it, and it can mean different things, not just to different entities, different individuals, but across cultures. It's going to mean something different to different people.
Right. Yeah. And even within that, there's a lot of things to say. And we should add a new term here is corrupting force. And the US
Yeah,
has a tendency to be a corrupting force. And so when you look at a place like Ukraine, Afghanistan, Iraq, these are all places that know how to farm. And could we possibly improve that system? Yes. Well, okay. What does farming look like today? What do they accept as possible? What might we do to slightly improve that? What external measure might we apply to ensure that that slight improvement is happening? I mean, like, this is a very systematic
yeah,
approach. And
yeah,
can we accept failure when this doesn't work? Because chances are it might not work. And when you go to a place like Afghanistan, where security is the one, two, three, and fourth priority of any operation, and you don't see your desired result because Pete and Rich say so, okay, well, Pete and Rich aren't here to lie to us. Why is this not working? Well, that's because the Taliban are saying, hey, knock that shit off. Like, I can't grow more crops and have more money because that's going to put me on Front Street, and Front Street's where you get killed.
yeah. Yeah. Well, it doesn't just get you killed. It gets your eldest son kidnapped, and now
Yeah.
he's fighting for the Taliban.
Now he's
You know?
he's two finger Mo, right? Like,
Yeah, yeah. It gets your
so
it gets your youngest daughter sold into slavery. It it
right.
gets it gets one of your kids marching into an open market with a suicide vest strapped on him. You
And you
know?
might say, well, those are examples for Afghanistan. We could do this for
Yeah.
any society. So
Mhm.
if you're in an unstable Ukraine and there's not enough to go around and there's intra competition between farmers, look out,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah. Exactly.
because who's going to patrol that?
Yeah, well, and you also like the corrupting force in this case could be the overt Western influence that decides to pick one farm over another,
No.
because we might be looking at a map saying, oh, this farm looks like it has better access to water and
Hmm.
irrigation. So let's focus our efforts here. Well,
Hmm.
you might have just elevated the town crook,
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
all we know, But that goes back to without having that, like you need some baseline knowledge. You need some boots on the ground knowledge, but you need some
Hmm.
baseline knowledge of the environment that you're working in because you also need to be able to assess whether you've improved or not, you know and even I would argue even the collection of that baseline knowledge can be corrupted,
Yeah.
so, and this is, I don't this isn't a conversation about bias, but we always introduce bias into our definitions, into our
Yeah.
observations. So this is why it's helpful to have, different sets of eyes on the problem, you know but also those sets of eyeballs on the problem need to have that open mind to be able to say we might get this wrong,
Hmm.
so we need to be able to implement that into not just our planning processes, but when it's time to, when we're at the end of that four-step equation, or we're at whatever it is and it's time for us to reflect, we have got to be honest with ourselves and the
Right.
progress we've made, or the damage that we've done, you know, or, accepting ourselves as potentially be, accepting our processes and our planning as also potentially a corrupting force. I think would be that should be in stage zero of the planning process. That should be.
And you're being kind. I would say
I'm
take
being
out the
very kind.
adverb. Yeah, take
Mhm.
out the adverb and say we are a corrupting force.
Yeah.
We are a net destabilizer. And until
Well,
we accept that reality,
mhm.
we will not change it,
I'm
you
I'm
know?
trying to I'm trying to be kind to public institutions because I work at a public institution, and that
Yeah,
reminds me I need to say my these thoughts and opinions are my own. They are not the
yeah.
thoughts and opinions of any administrator at Troy University, nor have I been compelled to say anything by anyone else. This is all me.
Okay. Fair enough. So, with that said, and you have these organizations that have quite a bit of power, corrupting power, if I might say, a source of corrupting power, the U.S. government, State Department, U.S. Ag, all these different organizations. And look, I'm not saying there's any nefarious intent here, but there's a lot of influence. And it might come from the center of government power and be pushed out without any kind of accompanying messaging or checking system, as we saw in our time. Like, hey, look, here's a message coming out from Kalab, boom, and it goes out into the valleys and it disappears at whatever, and no one goes to look and see did it work. So you have that node that shoots out a message and may or may not ever get checked or looked upon, but it is briefed as working, and then they're like, hey, there's a shadow government going on.
Yeah.
And so they send someone like Rich out to go discover what the shadow government is. And oftentimes, the shadow government is a surprising thing. So we look for the shadow government and we look at it from a point of view of threat, typically, because it is undermining the government that we want. By the way, hint, hint, the government that we put in place is also a form of a shadow government. So let's talk about shadow governments, because what exists right now currently in Ukraine and what will exist in a stable Ukraine, they're different things, right?
Mhm. Well, I mean, uh, war is going to change. War will change the state. The state makes war, but war also makes the state. So there's gonna be some adjustments, I'm sure, within the Ukrainian government. Again, I'm not an expert on Ukraine. I do know that since the fall of the Soviet Union, though, Ukraine was one of those countries that was probably, international organizations might score different countries on corruption metrics. I know Ukraine was one of those countries that had big problems with corruption, but corruption that we knew about, right? Because here's the thing about corruption, and going back to some of my work in the American states, um, the best one thing that makes corruption hard to study is because if it's done right, you can't see it. If
Yeah.
it's done right, you'll never know about it, right? And if you know the definition of corruption I've used in my work is very specific to public officials using their office for private gain, right? Now that's you could extend that to not just is a public official a bureaucrat who is unelected? I say yes. Some scholars may say no, right? They may only want to focus their research or aspects of their research on elected officials, for example. Elected officials are bribed by companies all the time, right? Except we don't call them bribes, we call them campaign contributions. And we don't it may not be a corrupt businessman. We might call it an interest group, right? But these are all things that if you kind of look at these, even looking at the American political system in more abstract terms, I argue that the interest group system itself is just like legalized corruption, you know,
Mhm.
because it allows undue corporate influence into our politics. And I'm still not convinced that corporations are always looking out for me and my family. They're looking out for profits. That's why corporations exist, right?
Right.
So, but looking at going back to my definition of public officials using their office for private gain, right? you got a lot of kickbacks. You got a lot of, here's a form of corruption I think goes understudied is nepotism. You know, people's kids getting sweet jobs in the companies because their parents are political figures, right? So I think that's a corrupting influence. Nepotism is a corrupting influence in our democratic political system. But, I often want to be harsh on our political system. Now, Ukraine's going to have to figure this out for themselves, right? But they've got a history of experiencing but corruption that we know
Mm,
about. Now, also my surface level review of Ukraine's recent history, they have taken steps with the help of the international community to try to deal with their corruption problem, to try to not just deal with the corruption you can see, but address perceptions of corruption. Because see,
mhm.
and that's one thing I had in my notes before we started this, because I wanted to, and I don't want to steer too far from your main point, but see, there's corruption that exists
Yep.
that we can see, there's corruption that exists that we can't see, right?
Yes.
But there's also objective corruption, right? How many people in your state were convicted of a crime that is bribery? Right? That is an objective measure of corruption. In fact, that's the measure that I used in some of my work, right? How many people are sitting in jail right now for corruption? Well, that's the
Yeah.
corruption we know about. That's the corruption that the Department of Justice went after and found, prosecuted. And you know what? The Department of Justice has a really, really high conviction rate. When they decide to go after your ass, you're damn near almost always done, right? But there's another type of corruption that is not objective. It is totally subjective. It might be based on people's objective ideas of reality, but there's the perception of corruption.
Yes.
Now,
Yes.
perceived corruption, I would argue, is worse. Hold on to your butts, ladies and gentlemen. Perceptions of corruption are worse than actual corruption because you can root out and get rid of and prosecute actual corruption. If it's government, if it's corruption in civil society, nonprofit organizations, all the time. Charities are under scrutiny all the time because is the charity I give money to? Are you using 90% of my charitable contribution for administrative purposes? I would say that's corrupt, right? Because you're doing something, you're dishonest, you're unethical. You may not be criminally charged, you might be criminally charged, but the perception of corruption. So
Mm,
you could find and get rid of those corrupt politicians. But if people perceive their government, if people perceive corporations, if people perceive, I'll pick on the Supreme Court because they're in
yeah.
the news these days. I perceive that Supreme Court judges who go on fancy trips that I could never afford, I perceive that to be corrupt because those people that you're going on those fancy trips with that are paying for those fancy trips have cases in front of you. I think judges should recuse themselves all the way up to the highest level. I think they should recuse themselves from any case that has to do with any of their friends. I don't care if the friend is rich or not. So, see, I perceive there to be corruption. Now, here's why perceived corruption is worse than actual corruption. Change my mind.
Yeah.
Try to
Yeah.
change my mind about what I just said about the Supreme Court. Try. And good
Let's
luck with that.
let me grab this and bring it back to another angle for corruption. So we had a friend of mine, Irene, was on the show. We were talking about state takeover of certain industries, and we know that there's so much Ukraine is a wealthy place in terms of resources. A lot of energy resources, a lot of farming resources. There's a lot of money to be made there.
And people power too.
People power for
Mhm.
sure, right? And this is a place that, if left alone, can really launch itself forward in a way that will be remarkable in our lifetimes. And so folks are definitely think tanking, writing
Mhm.
papers, picking their bad guys, picking their horses,
Yep.
and they're competing externally to try to build the Ukraine of the future in their interest, because it's in their interest, but also in
Mhm.
Ukraine's interest,
Oh
right? And
yeah. It's an
everybody's competing.
opportunity.
Right.
it's a business opportunity, it's a political opportunity,
Yes.
it's a geopolitical opportunity too.
Right. So there's that. There's also, and I guess the best way to say this is, in our lifetimes there was a USSR, and then that broke, and everybody had to scramble to become something else. And so all of these different states that have continued to fracture. Yugoslavia is a great example of a place that still hasn't healed itself. Some areas are doing better, some areas are not. If you go to Eastern Europe, you're still going to see donkey drawn carts. And you're like, what part of the world am I in? This looks nothing like Great Britain, right? Like it's completely different worlds. And so when you look at the former Soviet Union places and the business people that hustled their way through this totally new world, some of these guys were selling blue jeans in subways, right? And they became something. Some of these guys were thugs and they became something. And some of these guys were thugs that became legitimate business people that took care of people. Some of these guys stayed. It's a mess. And as you and I know, if you grew up in Taliban country, it's awfully hard
Yeah.
to change that perception that you're not still Taliban. Like, yeah, my cousin was a Taliban guy, is a Taliban guy. Yeah, you know what? I still wear tracksuits because I am from this area. However, I am a legitimate businessman. We have no idea what it is like to grow up in that community. We have no idea how to pick A from B from C and decide who is good and bad.
Yeah.
We're desperate to try to figure out who should be running these industries. We suck at picking the right person who should be doing it. We love to put the rock on top of someone's head and say, you're never getting out from under this rock, even though we have no idea. Rich, we suck at this stuff, right?
Yeah,
And it's
we do.
highly complex, and we try to put our reality on somebody else, and that's not our business anyhow.
Yeah, well, even I mean, look, the people in Ukraine right now, they didn't ask to be, for the Soviet Union to collapse. I mean, that was their state. They didn't ask for their centralized government to collapse. Well, maybe some of them wanted it, right? But
Yeah,
they didn't ask to be born into that. But here's the thing, once the Soviet Union collapses and you no longer have that central governing authority, and whatever sort of political culture, and separate political culture, like whatever civil society had developed under the Soviet Union, that's going to be impacted once the centralized government fails. And in this case, Ukraine, again, along with many of the other old Soviet states, they have had to chart their own developmental path forward. But what are we looking at, 30 years or so, since
yeah,
30 plus years since the Soviet Union fell,
yeah,
and we're still, I know scholars in the US, there's some in my department that are still trying to figure out, like, where are these new states going, you know
right,
I mean,
right,
it's essentially what would happen if the government in DC collapsed. Well, then all of a sudden, guess what? I'm in Alabama, and now Alabama is my nation, and you're in California. California government does things their way. You know, there might be some people that want to move out, move back in. I don't know, but it's kind of hard for us to fathom that, because we live in a we have more stability. But I will say this, but to go back to what you were saying about, there's still donkey drawn carts in some places in Eastern Europe, and you're wondering, why are all the tractors in Ukraine? Well, they took a different developmental path, and their trajectory, though, was born out of instability. Even the Soviet Union, whatever stability they tried to impose, I mean, after the Soviet Union fell and we were able to study this stuff with more clear lenses, because the Soviet Union was a closed system. You didn't have a lot of you just didn't have a lot of information. We had a whole lot of American political scientists that were Soviet scholars that all of a sudden, well, wait a minute, what are you going to do with the Soviet Union once the Soviet Union collapses? Do you have a job? Oh yeah, they actually had more work to do, because they're the people that had the bit of knowledge we had here in the West about that system in the first place. You
yeah,
know, so there has to be some understanding, though. You know, once you separate Ukraine from the Soviet Union, what's their trajectory going to look like? It's going to be based to a large extent on the remnants of the old system, but what's retained by that government. And
Yeah.
this is a country, like I said, going back the little bit that I do know about Ukraine, they were labeled as one of the most corrupt countries again and again, but they have taken steps in the last decade and a half to try to make things better, right? And by better, I mean less corrupt, to try to get rid of some of the criminality that was inherent in their political and economic systems. So I think we should, if anything, try to introduce that into the conversation,
Mm.
because this is a country that, for all of its resources, for all of its wealth, this is a country that essentially had to start at the bottom, and had to start from scratch, you know, and root out the corruption that was left over from the Soviet era. But you also have to deal with new corruption that's going to spring out. And I
Yeah.
would I would even go so far as to say some of those corrupt acts might have just been people trying to survive. Some of the
Yeah.
things we see as corruption, or we label as corruption, some of the things the international community has labeled as corruption, might be a guy selling stolen merchandise, but he's got to feed his family,
Let
you
me
know.
take you back to Afghanistan and let's
Mhm.
play this game, right? Because this is why you and I are talking, because we've seen this stuff in real life. There's a guy named Governor Zarif, the district governor, and he has ties to the Taliban. He's also the Mujahideen guy. He's also a holy man, and he's also one of the longest serving governors in this province. And one of the things was there was a wheat seed distro,
Mhm.
and it was assumed that he would be corrupt. And if you looked at his bio that we collected on him in the two shop, he was definitely tied to the Taliban. By the way, Mullah Omar lives 2 miles from the base camp that we're on, right? And so this is Taliban country. And if you don't know who Mullah Omar is, let me just tell you, he is bad guy number one. He is Raiders of the Lost Arkian in his ties to the Prophet Muhammad, right?
Yeah,
And
he
so
started the Taliban.
yeah, and he wears the robe of
Yep.
Muhammad. It's like, "Da-da!" So
He's the boss of
yeah,
bosses.
he's the boss. He's got one eye. He's like straight out of central casting for Afghan bad dude,
And
right?
he
And
was
he knew it.
living down the road.
Yeah, and we couldn't do a
I had
thing to
no
catch
idea.
him, right? And so when we say like that, Zarif is tied to the Taliban. Yeah, probably because this guy knows how to survive anything. But when we talk to him, we're like, hey, this guy wants to govern, and if we get out of his way, every time we do, he takes more and more of the reins, and he governs in a way that makes sense. And we're
Mhm.
not telling him what to do. And so we watched him progress, and the more we got out of his way, the more he did what he was supposed to do, and it was working. But you can't convince the two shop that he's not this bad person, because we have self-reported bad guy, bad guy,
Mhm.
bad. And anytime he does anything that we think we don't like, it's like, here's another bad thing. Here's another bad thing. So this informs my decision on Ukraine, is that we are bad at this. And so if you have someone that's like, oh, this guy sold uh, gas to people because he had to feed his family, or he had a business and he's like, hey, I'm going to go do a deal, but to do this deal I got to go talk to Jeff the mobster,
Mhm.
because if I don't talk to him, I don't get to do this deal, and I might get myself cut out of life, right?
Yeah.
And so we have all of these things where we don't understand their, and I'm going to use some of your terms here, or you're going to correct me on this, but the civil society is like requires that you have to go accommodate certain people because they own part of the economic reality, because the state does not. And
Yeah.
so to work, you have to do these things that makes you look illegal, but you're really extra legal because the legal system cannot provide. And so in Afghanistan, for example, and in Iraq, the civil court handled things up to and including murder, right? That's weird to us. In Ukraine, in post Soviet times, a lot of things are handled outside of the law because the state couldn't handle that. So when we look at
Yeah.
some of these guys who are corrupt, a lot of times these are just people who are like, I'm making sure the kids are getting fed. I'm making sure cotton is getting to the mill where it gets processed. I'm making sure that, and then you just line all these things up, and we're like, yeah, but you're an asshole. And
Yeah.
so it's like, what do you do about that, right? And
Yeah.
and if
Well,
you're the guy who's an asshole, how do you unasshole yourself?
yeah. Well, see, and here's the thing: is Zarif had to know the Taliban. or he wouldn't have been able to govern, because he was governing a space that was, I mean, we had bases there, but we didn't own that place. We didn't control much. I mean, we might have controlled the skies, but that we didn't control the, well, what we were supposed to do. The heart, we couldn't influence the hearts and minds, but Zarif could. So he knew how to work within the existing system. He knew what civil society looked like prior to us showing up. You know, but it's very difficult also to convince the two shop that Zarif's not the bad guy they painted him out to be, in part because they've inherited baseball cards and a dossier on Zarif that, why would they think it's wrong? But also, people from the two shop never went out, didn't have lunch and dinner with Zarif, didn't know Zarif's nap schedule to the extent that you were able to figure it out. You know,
Yeah.
don't catch this guy right now because he's napping, and don't mess with his nap, right? You know, so, are you and I corrupt because we brought him gifts of notepads and pencils and crayons for his children, which he just distributed to the community anyway? Are we corrupt now? Or are we working? Because, I mean, is that a bribe or a gift? You know, because
Yeah.
that's part of this conversation too. Here's another thing. Am I corrupt if I'm trying to run a business and I have to, like, pay a gratuity to a warlord because he owns, or he don't own anything, but he controls a stretch of highway? Then I need my trucks to move across this stretch of highway. That warlord, and these are examples from Afghanistan. There are warlords who control the space, right? You pay them tribute to pass through their space, or you're going to get blown up. In fact, you might not get blown up. Somebody else might get blown up to teach you a lesson, you know? And these are things that, going back to the state, like the United, like, we are a corrupting force, especially if we don't understand that, but we've got guidelines and policies and procedures we have to follow that don't necessarily account for that. But at the end of the day, sometimes you're walking around with big stacks of hundreds with, United States legal currency here. Like, is that itself not, like, is that not is that not a corrupting force? Does that not also represent a failure to understand the operating environment, so we don't corrupt it any more than maybe it already is? you know I think one thing with and I'm going to try to put on my comparative scholar hat. I think
Mm.
that, you know, the Ukrainian people already have a good idea of Western ways, if you will. They already understand capitalism. I think they've done a good job of trying to promote free markets within their own country since the Soviet Union collapsed, and they could. They've made some progress in terms of representative democracy, right? But if we are thinking, and any entity, the Department of State, Justice, Defense, any businesses, any nonprofits, if you think you're just going to pick up your operations and overlap them into Ukraine, you're sadly mistaken,
Mm.
because there's just a way of doing things, right?
Mm.
Just like I gave the example, God forbid, United States federal government collapses. All of a sudden, now you got the state of California, the nation state of California. You got the nation state of Alabama, right? Well, things are going to get run differently in different states, and things are done differently. The people in a state are different. It's one reason why, federalism's worked so long, so well here in the United States. You know, to a great extent, our federal government does allow states to chart their own course, right? What does that look like in Ukraine? Don't
Yeah.
just think about what that looks like when the Soviet Union falls. Now you've got all these satellite countries that used to be governed by the Soviet Union. They were the Soviet Union. Now they're
Yeah.
not, right? But what about within Ukraine, right? See, that's another level of layer of this conversation, right? That it's not just a regional thing. Like, there's domestic politics within Ukraine that have to be accounted for as well. And not being a Ukraine expert, I'm
Mm.
guessing that, just guessing, what goes on the west is not exactly what goes on in the east, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah.
So That comparative set of lenses, though, really, if any entity, any governmental, nonprofit, business entity wants to be doing work in Ukraine, there's some historical realities you have to accept and work into your planning processes. But there's also like time now and what has
Yeah.
become after that history, before the Soviet Union, now after the Soviet Union. How has their development been occurring, and to what extent can we continue the developmental path after the violence, well, after the
Yeah.
violence ends. I'm not convinced that it will, because I
Yeah.
think
Well, that's,
you're probably going to have separatist groups. You're going
oh,
to
yeah.
have more Russian incursion. Give it a name. But are there going to be regional differences within Ukraine in terms of development, right?
Yeah.
Are there going to be different industries acting different ways? The agricultural industry may not function the same way that the energy industry functions. you know the mining industry, the material production industry. There might be, and again, I've totally got my comparative political science hat on. Like, what domains of human existence will we be able to find
Yeah.
similarities and differences, right?
Oh
So
boy.
it's just like there are so many layers of complexity, but
Jeez.
like long term, but all like longitudinally speaking, but also like, the depth and the different
Yeah.
levels of like industry and, government government and governing,
Yeah.
you see.
One of the confounding things about this is a lot of these folks know each other.
Yeah.
You know, um, all the guys who run all the big industries who are 50 something to 65 something years old, you know who they all know? Putin. They all
Yeah,
know
of
Putin.
course
And
they
these
do.
guys, so when the fighting does stop, and we'll set separatists aside, we'll separate them out for a minute because that is going to be a really challenging problem. Hopefully that doesn't happen, but we'll let that problem be taken care of in another episode. Um, Russia and Europe are going to have to do business. Turkey is going to have to do business with Russia, Ukraine. All of these guys are all interconnected. We're going to have some
African
people.
African
Oh,
countries.
it's all going to interconnect, and they're going to have to cooperate. And there are existing business deals. And so if the state of Ukraine, I mentioned Irene earlier, and she said she bit her tongue and she said some of these industries are going to have to be taken over by the state. And she's like, and I'm a capitalist. I hate to say it. And
Mhm.
then I stepped on that and I go, ah, and it may be even less comfortable to say that because she's like, there's no other way to do it. And it's a poison pill we'll have to swallow. And then how do you unstatify? And then the person who's like, hey, you ripped me off, you have to compensate that person or not.
Yeah.
And then you have all of these problems. And it's like that. Do you twist that knob and get this gigantic cascading problem set that turns into separatism? So you have all of these things. Everybody knows Putin, all of these relationships that we can't possibly fathom because they all know each other. They've known each other for decades. All of these people that have worked together, there's trust that you can or cannot deal with. All of that stuff. I want to add another wrinkle into this too. You and I fall in on Zarif. I have been doing this kind of work for years and years and years, and I know how to build trust with a warlord, with a guy like Zarif. It's very delicate, slow work. It's not something I can. I'm good at it, and even I like don't doesn't always work right. And a lot of times when I fail, it's with an American. Like they're like, nope. Like you remember the Air Force Major who hated us, right? And so if I don't get there, I'll say this: you don't end up having a relationship with Zarif, right? Because I had to
Yeah.
convince the team to leave me alone because I knew how to talk to commanders, and the commander said to me, "Go out there and help me figure this out." And that was Jeff Stewart. And I'll probably have him on the show to talk about this as well. So if not me, no one ever knows that Zarif is a good guy for that short window of time. And we started to repair his image, and then we left. And I bet if we go back to Afghanistan, the first thing they do is they look at it, and he's a bad guy again, right? And so it's temporary. Will Hardy, another guy. He's with the Marines. He knows the Marines. He is a Marine. And they're like, I am itching to kill somebody. We're gonna pick someone. We're gonna go out and kill someone. And so they pick a guy. He calls this guy Aga John. It just means a man in Pashto or whatever, or Urdu, whatever the language they speak in that part of Afghanistan. Aga John is just a man, but he's an actual guy. And Will says, you know what? Let me look into this guy. Let's make sure we're getting the right guy. And because he had worked previously as a Marine with this Marine who was in charge of targeting, that guy goes, okay, Will, I'll give you 2 weeks. And Will came back and said, not only should you not kill this guy, he's about to be part of Jaroa, the legitimate at the time government of Afghanistan, and he is in charge of displaced people.
Yeah.
So the guy that the Marines would have 99 times out of 100, they would have twisted this guy's cap.
Hmm.
They would have killed him most of
Yeah.
the time, if not for Will being there. That is how likely we are, at least in the case of Afghanistan. And I would say, and in the case of Iraq, to go out and just go kill someone, right? Now, I'm not saying we're going to be lethal like that in Ukraine. I'm not saying that we're not. When we find a bad guy, we don't let him not be a bad guy. And if
Yeah.
that guy's desperate to be a good guy, it's really tough to get out of that thing. So again, this sorting process of someone who's worked extra state, and I'm not saying illegally, I'm saying outside of the state, even if they want to be a good guy, if someone is hell bent on them being bad, I don't know how you reliably recover that person unless you have an agent like a Pete, like
Yeah.
a Will, like a Rich.
Yeah. Well, because it's not just speaking truth to power, but it's making the observations that can then get turned into data that can be analyzed to say, look, this is not a bad guy. Or I should say, is not as bad as you're making him out to be. Right. Because look, for Zarif to govern, for Zarif to do the physical act of governing, he had to know the Taliban. He knew the Taliban's ways. And by the way, for him to govern also meant he was keeping people in his community alive.
Right.
He was working in a way that prevented bombs, that prevented bullets, you know? So, of course, is he Taliban? Is he a Taliban sympathizer? Or maybe he just understands his people, you know, and he understands what's needed to govern
Right.
in what the area of Afghanistan we're talking about is one of the most rural areas, not just in Afghanistan, but on the planet. It is
Yeah.
not easy to govern. It's not easy to walk around there, you know. But yet there are people that are living there longer than our country has been a country,
Yeah.
and they're just waiting for us to leave. Of course he knows the Taliban, right? Of
Yeah.
course he probably has lunch with them, you know. But here's the other thing. In Ukraine, if you wanted to do business, I'm sure everybody had to know Putin. You know, Putin is, by many accounts, probably the most wealthy person in the world because we don't even know how much he owns or controls. You
Right.
know,
Yeah.
so if you're going to do business in Ukraine at the fall of the Soviet Union, you had to work through some leaders. Putin shows up, and as I see it, you know, it's just, hey, let's elevate organized crime into the government and run this place. So Putin's always going to get his cut. So if you're going to do business, everybody's got to know Putin. You know, Jeff Bezos knows Putin. Elon Musk knows Putin because they had to do business. They want to do business. You're going to have to know the man. You know, it's mob style governance. It's mafioso. You know, as a president, but you know, it's if we don't, and I'll go, we got to go back to step zero of our planning processes, and we got to figure out a way to account for this, you know,
Hmm.
because you can't have a Zarif on the targeting list. By the way,
Right.
you get rid of him, you're going to destabilize the whole area.
Yeah.
And you're not just going to
Yeah.
destabilize the whole area,
Yeah.
like the Taliban are going to, like, we're going to get ourselves killed, you know?
That is such a powerful thing that you just said there. That we'll say Ukrainian
Hmm.
person who comes up, and was whatever he was selling jeans or Bruce Springsteen tapes in a Russian subway, or a Soviet subway, and he ends up working in Turkmenistan. He makes a deal there, and he has a company there, and he has a company, and he builds an empire, right? And he is extra legal because that's the only way to do it, right? Because there is no state to work within.
The laws could have been unclear.
Yeah, if there,
He could have been working in the gray area
yeah, yeah,
because, you know, governments
yeah.
don't always make the best laws. They're not always transparent, you
And
know?
he's built trust. He's
Mhm.
used relationships. He's saved the day. He's been the person, and he feels beholden to these people as much as they are to him. If you rip that person out, like you just mentioned, the person that comes in next, he didn't give a fuck about anybody else.
Yeah. Well, and what you might also do is you might take down a hometown hero. And now the local population doesn't like you even
Oh
more,
boy.
than before,
Yeah.
and they might be even more prone
That's
to
powerful, Rich, man.
engage
That's
in corrupt acts after you've like, look, you've taken down our guy,
hmm
and we know it was you. Let's
yeah.
say maybe it's the Department of Justice who
Yeah.
brings down a businessman or enacts sanctions against someone,
Yeah. That's
right?
the hero of Sheboygan. You just took out the hero of Sheboygan. That's not a bad guy.
Yeah.
We have a statue to that guy,
Yeah. Yeah.
you know?
I mean, and here's the thing, like, we could go back to Zarif because, I mean, you and I have written on this, and in fact,
Yeah.
that reminds me, I gotta throw another narrative about him in the paper I'm working on for the upcoming Air Force's culture conference. But you take that guy out, I mean, people loved him.
Yeah.
Like, his people loved him. He wasn't even from the area, if I remember correctly, but he knew the people. He was of the people, and they respected him
Mm.
because he had that extra layer of religious authority.
That's right.
In the business world, it may not be religious authority, but hey, you're the guy who pulled yourself up by your bootstraps.
Yeah.
Man, you're a role model. Did you
Yeah.
have to, maybe you had to pay off some warlords so you can move a truck across a road. I don't think, does that make you corrupt? Does that make you a savvy business person? You
Yeah.
know, one man's gift is another man's bribe, you know?
That is such a strong point because Zarif would communicate with notes. And some kid coming through, hey, where you going to? You going there? Okay, here, take this note to this guy. And then it would be, and you pointed this out with your background, with your earlier work before the PhD. That's a holy man saying,
Mhm.
hey, I need to talk to Bob. He'd write a note, the kid would take it out, and the note would get to Bob, and Bob would show up. He had command over that area
Yeah.
because not because he was governor, partly, but mostly because the holy man just spoke out and said, I need to see you. And what we realized was when the Afghans were left to their own devices and made big decisions, there's always a holy man there. And that holy
Yeah.
man was usually the holy man above Zarif.
Mhm.
So even he was like, I got to have someone here who's a boss in the holy world
Yeah.
before we get this thing done. And if you're on the business side of things, since we're talking about business in Ukraine, if you need to get a load through, you come to that business manager like, hey, I got to get a load to this area. Who do I got to talk to? Like, don't worry about it. I'll take care of it.
Mhm.
Because these guys have that network, they have that trust, they have those relationships. And to get things done, that's how they do it. We may not like that here, but if someone from there came here and they said, hey, I want to get a load of something from Chicago down to Alabama, he's like, well, you got to be careful. You don't pay your gas tax each state through. You have to fill up. And every state with
Yeah.
your big rig, the government will all come after you. So
Mhm.
here's how you do it. And we
Yeah.
would explain the same process.
Pay your
Ours
tolls.
looks different. Yeah,
Pay your
absolutely.
tolls.
Yeah, and you
Well,
cannot avoid them.
that's right.
If that way station says it's open, you have to stop there and you have
Yep.
to pay. You have to have your invoice. No, you cannot over. And we would explain our process, and it would seem cumbersome, burdensome, and stupid,
Yeah.
and they
But
would want to avoid it.
but we've also got more of a functioning state that
Right.
levies tax, that has the ability to raise revenues through taxation,
Yeah.
and also put up a stop sign and say, you have to stop at that stop
Yeah.
sign, or we're going to extract another fine from you,
Exactly.
another
Yeah.
form of taxation. Now, as I see it too in the post-Soviet space, like the political science and scientist in me says, how many businesses, how many like civic groups were operating in the absence of law, in the
Mm,
absence of a state? See, the state's supposed to provide security, you
right.
know. We got Alabama state troopers. We don't have enough of them, in my opinion. These state troopers, we're a very rural state here in Alabama. These state troopers have, each state trooper has like hundreds of miles of highway,
Yeah.
right? That they
Yeah.
can't possibly, and this is a public safety thing, you know? So anytime I hear like, oh, there's a budget crunch, we're going to not have as many state troopers, I'm like, that is crazy. But we also have a government that functions a little bit, I hesitate to say better, but
Yeah.
functions. We have a functioning state. In the absence of, Soviet control, now all of a sudden you've got all these satellite countries that have to go at it on their own, you know. So who's providing safety and security, but also who's extracting taxes from business, from individuals, just to keep the state functioning, because the state
Yeah.
doesn't function without resources. So my guess is you probably got more than one business person, especially in Ukraine, who had to exist in the absence of the
Yeah.
rule of law, had to
Yeah.
exist in the absence of, we like to talk about free markets and capitalism, but look, every government controls its economy some way, shape, or form. All economies are mixed. Okay. Hate to tell you this out there. There are no pure forms of an economy.
No.
In fact, there might be a more pure form of an economy that we left behind in Afghanistan, because now they're back to bartering, you know.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so you know, how do individuals exist in
Mm,
interpersonal relationships, but how do businesses exist
yeah.
in the
Yeah.
absence of a state, or in the absence of a functioning state? Because one thing the
Yeah.
state's supposed to do is provide security, but then it also has to manage the welfare of its population. Then that's more of a developmental definition of the state and what the state is. But, how many Ukrainian businessmen were just operating, eh, not just trying to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, but maybe they're trying to, like, they already have successful businesses. They're trying to keep them successful.
Right.
And all of a
Right.
sudden, your government has collapsed. So, what are the elements that are going to rise to the top to
Sure.
kind of manage, the functioning of society? You
Yeah.
know,
Or if a need shows up, or someone entrepreneurial says, I can get my hands on X,
yeah,
this much of this, that, there's this thing, but you've got to enter into an unknown space. You got to go to, oh, I don't know, Kyrgyzstan, because there's this unused raw material or this thing. And you like, can you help me create a deal? Yeah, I think I can. You need an entrepreneurial person. You also need someone that has the connections to close that loop.
mhm,
And when there's not enough things out there, you come across these things when because you're a person who can do that. And this is like the classic Thomas Sowell middleman, right? Like, oh, we hate that
right.
person, but who else would do it? And yes, you make money when you're a middleman, when you can stick your neck out and you can close a deal. We tend to not like that person, but they're everywhere because there's opportunities to like if you were a sheep herder and you can sell 50 sheep, you never raise 200. But if that person comes along, like, can you raise 200 sheep? Yeah, I can raise them, but no one's going to buy 200 sheep. Like, I'll sell them. Can you raise 1,000? I can raise as many as you want. All right, I want you to raise 2,000. All right, then I do. And then all of a sudden, that person becomes much more profitable because someone else can sell the sheep because they're busy raising sheep. That's their job. And so those middlemen, they uh they get characterized very negatively. And Soul's work on that stuff is brilliant. And you see the rise of these people that do well, but they're typically because we can't account for how they do it, and yet there they are. And it's almost a universal truth throughout humanity that these folks that fill these gaps, that take these chances, that go do things that no one else wants to do, they over time they do really well.
If I was, and I'm now I'm thinking about how to research this problem,
Yeah.
and I think you could get a lot of traction. You could learn a lot if you wouldn't even have to go back in time. But I would do like some interpersonal interviews with Ukrainian business people. And I would have maybe a standard template of questions to ask them, but I would ask them open-ended questions and ask them, like, I would want to know, like, were you doing like business as usual? Okay, Soviet Union collapses, then what happens, right? So in the absence of laws, or if the law is unclear, like, there's still a culture of business that develops, right? So I would like to know, if I had like one question that I could ask of a random sample of Ukrainian business persons, I would ask them, has the law has have laws, or I would want them to talk about how laws that govern their domain of operations, their businesses, have they changed? Have they changed? How have they changed? But also, like, I could see a situation where business people are operating in the absence of law, and then all of a sudden a law comes along and, like, wait a minute, you've changed the way we do business. Maybe nothing illegal was happening anyway. Well, it couldn't be anything illegal because there were no laws, or the law was unclear. Or here's another one that kind of throws me for a loop. Maybe it was one of those laws that aren't really ever prosecuted.
Mhm.
So we're just doing business, you know?
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
would like to know how many people got caught up in, no, we're doing business one way and now the law
Yeah.
changes. Because it takes time for business to, not all businesses aren't always trying to break the law. That causes them trouble,
Yeah.
legal trouble, right?
Yeah.
Department of Justice comes down and knocks on your door and you don't want that at, business
Yeah.
headquarters. But how long does it take business to catch up to the law? You see, I guess that would be
Yeah.
one of my talking
Yeah.
points. Like regardless of what the business is, you know, like, hey, a new law
Yeah.
passed. Like, how do you catch up to that? You can't just flip a switch and, like, all of a sudden change the way your manufacturing processes work. Maybe you can. I'm not a business person, so
Yeah.
clearly
It
I'm
strikes
not.
me. It's interesting too when I think about all this stuff, and when we come in and try to do this reconstruction, and again when we assess these people in Ukraine and these successful business people, I bet because I know people. If you spent the last several decades surviving, thriving, making money by using business as your main tool to solve problems, I bet that's your default for solving problems. Like it sounds ridiculous to say that, but to prevent this war, to patch up things, you're like, hey, let's make a deal. Let's bring so and so in on a deal. That'll make them less crabby. To include Putin, like, hey, can we just
Yeah.
prevent war by just like let's go make a deal and let's cut Putin in and chill him the fuck out a little bit, like that. All of this stuff, like if we and look, this is globalism, right? Like, can we just be so interconnected with business? This is look, Trump's tried to do this with the Middle East. Like, can we tie businesses to Israel and just mellow all of the Middle East out? Um, that's what Netanyahu's saying. He's like, let's all just go make a bunch of money on technology, Middle East. That's chill, right? And so when you look at Ukraine and Russia and all the partners around there, these business people are trying to do the same thing. They're trying to say, let's all go out. Let's use energy. Let's use agriculture. Let's use technology. And let's all, be connected so that we don't have these stupid fights. But if you want that to be a negative thing, and you want to say, look at them doing deals with Russia, dirty, dark Russia and Belarus, you can make them be bad guys. But in reality, that's how they solve problems. These are business people.
Yeah, and you run the risk of alienating not just the business owner or the business facilitator, but businesses employ people. And
Right.
at the end of the day, you need a society to support, the government that lasts once they repel the Russian invasion, the government that changes. You need people in society to support that. And those
Yeah.
people are generally workers. Not all of us are, you know, entrepreneurs and business owners, so you risk alienating the very population that you're
Mm,
intending to help, you know.
yeah.
I mean, let's go back to the female engagement thing that you and
Oh
I
boy.
spent some time on. We alienated some of these same women that we
Yeah.
claim to be, we're going to empower them, like
Yeah.
we alienated them with our programs that thrust them into the spotlight immediately in ways that they didn't want, you know.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden, like, hey, let us know if you can, get this survey of women. I'm like, no, I'm not even gonna. No,
Yeah.
I'm
How
oh,
many women did we get killed, maimed, beat up?
yeah,
You
like
know? Oh
the
my
acid
God.
in the face thing, come on,
Yeah.
people, and
Yeah.
oh, by the way, the
Uh,
Taliban aren't shooting at me because I'm not being a dick.
yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to
Uh,
keep not being a dick. And, so let me try that, you know,
yeah.
but we run the risk of, I guess, losing the audience, depending on now, like sometimes you're going to have to prosecute somebody. Somebody's
Yeah.
doing things wrong, at like child labor, human trafficking, like there's just some environmental standards, there's health and safety that's got to be taken care of, and there's some clear cut laws. But listen, if you just go out and label everybody a Putin acolyte, well,
Hmm.
you're not going to be able to do any business there. And you're
Yeah.
essentially going to be taking, in the case of Ukraine, you're going to be trying to take a step forward, you're going to be taking 10 steps back,
Yeah. Yeah.
without fully comprehending, And I'll go back and use that word culture. You got to
Yeah.
understand the culture, and there are cultural
Uh-huh.
differences, not just between us and them, but
Oh
even
man.
within that country. And as I was trying, I might have mentioned earlier, there's even cultural differences within industries. They're different ways of being and ways of belonging that you got to account for if you want to do things the right way. And
Yeah.
I'm going to go back to fall on one of you and I statements. It's let's do less harm.
Yeah.
You can't do no harm, right? That's impossible. There's already a war.
Right.
We're already there. But can we figure out how to do less harm?
Yeah. Yeah.
And that
Yeah. Like
takes a healthy amount of cultural knowledge, but also appreciation for those differences and a willingness to figure out those nuances, right? You got to be willing to go learn. You got to be willing to go back to stage zero and maybe recalibrate some of the
hmm
assumptions that went into your planning before you got to stage one.
Yeah. You got to be willing to let Pete and Rich go out and go, hey man, this ain't right.
Yeah.
You just fired Dave. You stole his company from him. And you know what Dave did 10 years earlier? He and this town, they fixed this miracle thing. They did
They
this. And he
kept the
said, no
schools
matter
open,
what,
you
yeah, no
know?
matter what, these schools will always stay
Yeah.
open and
We
it's
have a
your town.
library because of this guy,
Yeah, we did this together
Mhm,
and it'll never change. And you guys just changed it. You guys
mhm.
just broke the contract.
Yeah.
And they're pissed about that and they're never going to forgive you. This reminds me of the time in Iraq when we had like the Iraqi general, like, you're the boss. This is all your territory. And so the Iraqi general came over to the American camp, and the Americans are like, yeah, you can't come on this camp right now. Sure, you're the senior commander in this area, but you're going to have to wait outside the camp. And they sweated that dude out for hours, and he was pissed. And he didn't forgive a commander for the next 3 or 4 commanders until we left that area.
Yeah.
Never forgave us,
He
right?
should. He shouldn't.
And I told every commander, like, this dude's going to be pissed at you, and he's not going to be as cooperative as you want him to be. You might think he's happy, but he's holding something over your head, and I'll tell you what it is. And so these guys would all try to roll out the red carpet. He was still mad, and there was no fixing it.
Yeah.
We didn't ever figure out how to fix it. And so these kind of things, these are these nuggets that you have to have a Pete and a Rich to go, listen to me. There's a problem here. You got to go fix that community. You better bring Dave with you because Dave is the one that knows these guys. And you better say, we fucked up. We're sorry about this. We didn't mean to fuck with Dave. We didn't know.
Yeah.
And you got to make right, because if you don't, it's going to be impossible to fix.
Yeah,
It's
once you violate trust, especially when
Yeah,
it's disrespect is hard to come back
yeah.
from,
Oh man,
and it's really like in interpersonal relationships, it's hard. But when it's
yeah.
done by governments to people,
Uh
those
huh.
governments lose legitimacy, and governments that aren't legitimate in the minds of their people. This is one reason why Afghanistan did not work the way we wanted
Yeah,
to, because we
yeah,
never really bothered to. Oh, we had a legitimate government on paper,
yeah.
but you and I go on a patrol right across the street from the district center.
Oh
We go a
boy.
few miles out, and it's like, hey, you know, what do you think about the government? Like, I don't think about the government. The government
Yeah,
doesn't work. In fact, district governor still owes me money because he took some of my goats for a party and never paid me, you
yeah.
know. Well, why don't you guys use the courts? Because if I use the court, my son's going to disappear and be in jail for 9 months. So I go to the Taliban. We got this thing called Sharia law. Perhaps you've heard of
Yeah.
it. And the Taliban
Perhaps.
judge gives us a swift decision with the authority of God,
Oh
and we
man.
abide by that every time.
Yeah.
So what do you mean, Gyroa? You know, what's
This
that?
I gotta tell this story because everybody needs
Mhm.
to hear this. So Rich and I were tasked to figure out some things about rule of law, which, by the way, the American rule of law guy was not all that comfortable with, but he was privy to all our reports. And we went and talked to the judge. The judge, not the point of this story, but one of the things about him is like, why is he not getting cases to hear? And so first he's like, I would love to hear cases. I don't know how your guys' court works, but judges in our court, we don't go get cases. They're brought before us. And we're
Yeah,
like, ooh, great point.
yeah.
He's like, by the way, I still don't have my furniture. I have an
Mhm.
empty room. I sit over there. Third, I'm terrified of these people. I'm not from around here. The rule of law American guy said he was going to get me a gun. I'm
Yeah,
still waiting for that.
yeah,
I'm going on vacation and the other judge is coming in. You guys let me know what you find out. So that's part one of the story. part two is Rich and I go across to the other district, the center of the capital. So this is the most populous district.
Mhm.
We leave and go to the capital, and we're going to go look more into rule of law and try to find out why the top cop and the prosecutor aren't bringing cases. We get to the chief of police's office, and outside his door, for all the way down the wall, are dads waiting to go see the boss to find out about their kid and how they could get him out of trouble. So
Yeah.
court was happening every day. It just didn't
Court.
involve that judge.
No.
The rule of law guy was not happy about our reform.
No. Because this is the system we gave you and you're not using it. No,
Yeah.
they had integrated their old system, which was very informal.
Yeah.
They integrated that into the data.
Yeah.
In fact, they never changed, but
Yeah.
they and in fact, had we let them integrate their way into, our way of doing things, it might have worked better. But one problem that we have, that we had in Afghanistan is there's no swift justice in the gyroa system. Well, because there's processes, there's procedures. You got to collect the evidence. You got to, show the evidence to the other side. You have to get lawyers involved, and they're like, we don't do any of that.
Yeah.
We go
We're going to
find,
send this off to the crime lab, and everybody's like,
yeah,
what are you
yeah.
talking?
What crime?
If
What are you
I
talking about?
ever took the time to do it and went to the crime lab, I could say, how many times do you guys send cases out to court, and how many times are there convictions? And that
Mhm.
number is going to be somewhere around zero.
Yeah. I didn't just pull the 9 months number, out of thin air. Like that was the wait time, at
Yeah,
least 9 months. But why do that when you can go to the Taliban? They'll have you an answer in less than 9 hours.
yeah.
You
And I
know?
wasn't kidding about the thing. They'll handle a murder right there in house. They'll
Oh
handle it,
yeah.
and they all know what to expect.
Hmm.
They deal with it, and there's money exchanged, and they handle it in what they call civil court. That's what they do.
Yeah.
One other thing that I wanted to bring in, and just because it's important that we understand the failure of our most educated people. You and I have both seen this. The State Department send people out, the Kennedy School of Graduate kid who's got a master's degree, and they send him far afield, and he goes to talk to a governor, and eye rolls a governor. This is a guy who has a gun on his hip, and he's glad to dot you in the eye if he disagrees with you. You know, just because you have a degree, I'm talking directly to you in the audience. If you think you know what you're doing, you don't. And if you think you understand what it's like to be a Ukrainian elder or a farmer or anything else, shut up and listen, because you don't understand what it means to be these people. I'll let Rich talk about this, but the respect you have to have. If you think you know what's going on, stop. You're making the first and second mistake. You are destabilizing, and you don't realize you're making the mistake. And so these are the first two mistakes.
Yeah, I would just add there's going to be a bunch of, collateral damage, if you make the wrong move, and chances are you're going to make the wrong move, you know. So, a really wise person once told me I never learned anything while talking.
Mm.
And, he was telling me to shut up and listen is what he was doing, and I've since, tried to do that. But you can have all of your degrees, but you can't, I mean, I don't know if you can have a degree in experience. You
Mm.
know, I don't know if they offer that anywhere. You have to go. Again, we use the phrase boots on the ground, and it means something different, to you and me probably than it does to, you know, other people out there that have never had their boots on the ground. But you got to have that on the ground perspective, and it doesn't come easily. You're not going to get it overnight, but you got to listen and you got to pay attention. And you also have to take your academic ideas and just put them in the abstract for the most part. I'm not saying they're not valuable, but
Right.
then go and then see how what's happening on the ground, how does it match with your theoretical or philosophical understanding? Or I will even go so far as to say your policy level understanding, right? Go and get some experience, but also, in particular, I'm talking to the DOD here. Don't just rely on what the guy before you said about the situation, especially if the guy before you, pissed off the commanding general of the area, or if the guy before you, you know, never really bothered to test some of those assumptions in those intelligence reports, you
Yeah.
know, because if you never leave the two shop, you're only going to get what's fed into the two shop. And it often, maybe you can't go make your own observations, but you got to have people who are willing to get their hands dirty, or at least go watch other people get their hands dirty.
Yeah.
Because I'm gonna use my air quotes. I'm not gonna bribe Mr. Warlord so I can go over his road, but I will give him his gift, you know. But maybe you can sit in the back of the truck and watch how it happens, and then you can report that back, right? Because Mr.
Yeah.
Warlord may not be a bad guy. Mr. Warlord might actually be your best eyes and ears on the ground if you get to know him, you know.
Yeah.
Mr. Warlord might actually respect that district governor also, because he understands that district governor is a religious elder. And that is more than just the cherry on top in Afghanistan. And to a great extent, from what I've learned, Iraq, that's more than just the cherry on top. You know, it's the whole damn cake.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, listen, I've had you for about an hour and a half, man, and it's been awesome. Some of that stuff was really incredible. And
Well, I hope
it's
somebody's listening, and I hope it helps bring some
yeah,
clarity. Like, if anything, demonstrates the complexity of this. If you're going to have a conversation about corruption, you better be ready for at least an hour and a half, at least if you're talking
yeah,
to me,
yeah,
you know. But you got to be ready to challenge your own assumptions, and you got to be ready to learn something, you
yeah,
know. And it is complex.
yeah. And when I think about corruption, I often say, like, look, we are the corruption, and people reject this. And this is like the first thing. Like, if we can't start with we are part of the problem, we are the instability, then we can't even begin to fix it. I think of you're going to someone who has to use a well to drink water, and that well is the corruption. They go down there, and if we didn't provide that well of corruption, they wouldn't fill their bucket with it. They would do something else.
Yeah.
And so when you bring $500 million to a party, people are going to want it. They're going to do anything, to include killing people, to get it.
Bags
So,
and bags of money,
oh my
literally
God,
bags of
500
money.
$500,000, please build a park, and we won't hold you accountable if you don't do it. Okay, thanks for
Yeah.
the $500,000. See you later.
And
I'll be back next month for the next park project. I got a great location. It
yeah.
looks exactly the same as the other.
Yep.
So we are the corruption until we change that, and we're going to be the corruption in Ukraine. So those are my final parting words. What do you want to say in closing, Rich?
Oh, I just want to say thanks for having me on. It's been a while, but this is something that, I've done some research previously, specifically on corruption, but I've got school starts for me in about a week and a half. So I'm actually still prepping one of my classes, a Foundations of Political Science class, and we got a section on corruption. So this is going to help support some of that. But I really appreciate the opportunity to talk, not just with you, but with the audience about this thing, because, um, I do hope for the best for the Ukrainian people. I commented to one of my colleagues a few weeks ago that if I was younger, and I had no ties to family and friends back here, I might have picked up arms, and you know, I might be playing in the dirt over there helping the Ukrainians. Maybe.
Well, I'm
You know.
glad you're old and you have a family and friends, and you didn't go do that shit. We need you here, man. You've done
Yeah.
enough. Knock that shit off. All right, let me roll
No,
this
this
clip.
is this
Yeah.
is this is good stuff. I appreciate it. And like I said to the audience, if you guys are interested in some of the things I wrote, my papers on corruption are very easy to understand. They use states as the units of analysis, but you should have no problems finding that stuff. If you want to reach out, I'm easy to find on email. And like I said, I'll say it again. These were my own words and thoughts, not the words and thoughts of anyone from my organization. Go Trojans.
Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly. Thank you